So, hello everyone. Thanks to be here for this talk. So, you will have 1 hour of talk on Juju. So, I will not indulge more in the presentation. I leave the word to James Page for the service orchestration, and thanks to be here. The speech is orchestrated in 3 different parts. So, he will have the explanation and the presentation, then we have a question and answer session. If you can take the notes on what you want to ask, and then ask in the QA session. And then at the end, we have 5 minutes to allow you to change the room if you want to go in another talk later. Thanks.
Thanks, Enrico. Hi, so I'm James Page. I work for Canonical, which is the commercial entity behind the Ubuntu project. I'm technical lead of the Ubuntu server and cloud workloads team, which is a bit of a mouthful, but if it runs on Ubuntu server, it's my problem. Amongst other things, I'm a core dev, Debian maintainer. I'm a long-time Java developer, in actual fact, and a relative Python novice. So I'm going to be talking about a project I've been involved with for the last 12 months, which is Juju. So just a quick outline of what I'm going to present. We're going to have a quick 101 about Juju and Charms, what it's all about. And I'm going to walk you through an example deployment so you can get a feel as to how you deploy an application with Juju. So, what is Juju? Juju is a service orchestration tool. It's written in Python and Twisted, and it's good at coordinating deployment of services onto Ubuntu server instances. The semantics of how you use it are very much at the service level, not the server level. So when you're using Juju, you don't have to worry about deploying individual servers. You're really worried about the overall shape of your deployment and the relations between the services within it. It's not a configuration management tool. I've frequently been asked, is this like Puppet? Is this like Chef? It's not. It's complementary to configuration management. It's just a layer above it, and you can use Puppet or Chef in your Charms to help deploy your services, but it doesn't replace those tools. So just to focus back in on that coordination of relations between services, if we look at a wiki that requires a database, those are two quite discrete services. Juju is able to deploy both the database and the wiki service onto Ubuntu server and then relate the two things together and allow them to be configured into a running service. It also allows easy scale up and scale down, so adding additional capacity to a deployed service is pretty easy, and removing capacity from those deployed services is pretty easy as well. Now, the caveat on that is that your application has to be able to support horizontal scale up and scale down to be able to support that type of function. The other neat thing about Juju is it abstracts you from your underlying infrastructure provider. Juju can talk to public and private clouds. We've deployed services on OpenStack using its EC2 API, on Amazon Web Services using the EC2 API. You can deploy into your data center. We have another project called Ubuntu MAS, Metal as a Service, which abstracts provisioning of hardware away from users. So you can basically say, give me a server, and Juju can use that service and the API it provides to provision actual physical machines and deploy services onto them. Or you can use what we call the local provider. The local provider is really aimed at developers. So it allows you to run a full Juju environment to a limited scale on your own laptop. And it's great for iterating through development of Charms as you're testing and deploying your service before you go and spend some money in Amazon or buy some servers. So that kind of leads us in as to what's the complementary part of Juju that is Charms. So a charm is a distillation of developer and operations knowledge into a service that can then be repeatedly deployed, scaled, and related to other services. They can be written in any language that can be executed on Ubuntu server without too many additional dependencies. We have examples in Shell, Python, and PHP. I don't know who wrote the PHP one, but credit to them. And they have a well-defined structure that Juju understands. So there's some metadata associated with a charm. Its name, the relations it provides that other services can consume, and the types of those relations, and the relations it requires to be deployed effectively. So in our wiki example, it would probably provide some sort of website relation, so you could put a proxy on the front end of it, and it would require a database relation, so we can plug in PostgreSQL or MySQL into the back end. It has some configuration. Charm authors can specify configuration for their charm, which allows the charm to be specialized at deploy time without actually changing the code base. So these are typically personalization of the application, tweaking and tuning for your own infrastructure, although the charm can do that itself if it wants to try and do that intelligently. However, my experience is it's never quite as rule of thumb as you can make it. So actually having those as configuration options for the users of your charm makes a lot of sense. And then there's a set of hooks. So the example we have on screen at the moment is for the MongoDB charm. Juju has a well-defined set of hooks. So there's an install hook that's executed as the charm is deployed onto the Ubuntu server instance. That's responsible for installing the software, doing any initial configuration before the charm is then configured using a config changed hook, and then started using the start hook. There are then potentially a number of relation-related hooks that will fire when your deployed charm is related to other deployed charms. We have relation joined, relation changed, broken, and departed. And they all fire at lifecycle points during the relationship between two deployed services. We also have an upgrade hook and a few other hooks, which I won't go into now. But Juju knows how and when and at which points during the life cycle of a deployed charm to execute these hooks. We also have a lot of charms already. So it's a good point to introduce the charm store. The charm store is really, for Ubuntu, we have the main archive with all the official Debian packages that you can use on Ubuntu. The charm store is the equivalent repository for Juju. So by default, when you do Juju deploy MongoDB, it will go to the charm store and it will retrieve the official reviewed uploaded charm and deploy that onto your selected environment. Those charms have been reviewed by the core charmers team, and they are regularly tested on multiple providers to prove that they're still functional. And there's a relatively big community around charmers now, probably 20 to 30 people with a core of 15 people or so developing charms. And we now have about 80 charms in the charm store. And there's a selection on screen there to give you an idea as to what you can grab and deploy today. Okay, so let's walk through a deployment of a Django application using Juju. So, I'll give you a brief overview of the actual application itself. So, the application we're going to be deploying, and this is a walkthrough rather than a demo, so you can get a feel. I didn't trust the network for my live demo. Is the Summit application. Summit is a Django application that has web, database, and cache components to its deployment. It's used at the Ubuntu Developer Summit, so anybody who's attended a Ubuntu Developer Summit, you probably use this to subscribe to the sessions you want to go to generate your own personalized session, which you can then use, view on your mobile or tablet or whatever. It is also this year going to be used for the Linux Plumbers Conference in August, and that is using a Juju deployed Summit application rather than the traditional canonical IS deployed version of Summit that we've used for past developer summits. So the charm was written by one of my colleagues, Mark Mims, specifically for plumbers. It's based on the generic Django charm, which is written by another one of my colleagues called Michael Nelson. Unfortunately, we weren't able to specialize the deployment of the Django charm sufficiently to support all the requirements of Summit. So we've effectively forked it. We've taken the Django charm as the base, and we've overlaid the specific Summit configuration into the hooks that support this charm. It's a really good example of making use of configuration management tools. Although the hooks themselves are written in Bash, the majority of the service configuration is done using Puppet running in headless mode. So if you look at the tree view of the charm on the right-hand side there, you'll see that there's Puppet manifests and Puppet templates that form part of the charm that's used to deploy this service. If we look at the metadata on the left-hand side, we can see that it requires a PostgreSQL database, and it can also talk to a Memcache server as well. I think the key message here is that the production of this charm has been about consolidation of knowledge from the Summit application developers and the canonical IS staff who've deployed Summit in the past into a single charm. And pretty much anybody, including myself last Friday when I was preparing for this presentation, can pick up and deploy onto the provider of their choice using Juju. Okay, so getting started with Juju. The first thing you need to do in any Juju deployment is to bootstrap it. This is a requirement for any of the providers, and basically it deploys the first node into your environment that's then going to be used to subsequently deploy and manage all other services, service units that are going to be supporting your deployed services. In the case of the local provider, which this example was done on, it checks that the required dependencies are installed to support executing the local provider locally. So that includes, we use Apache Zookeeper for coordination across the deployed Juju environments. So it checks that that's installed and can be initialized and started. We start a small storage server. Juju has some object storage requirements. If you're using EC2, it uses S3. If you're using OpenStack, it uses the equivalent object storage mechanisms provided by OpenStack. But for the local provider, we have a very small twisted application that just provides that equivalent functionality for local development. And then we start up another couple of agents. We start the machine agent, which is responsible for maintaining the machine state in Zookeeper during the life cycle of that machine. And the provisioning agent, which is then used to provision the subsequent nodes that our services are going to be deployed onto. So we're now going to deploy some infrastructure services. We're going to use a charm store. So we're going to grab the PostgreSQL and Memcached charms directly from the charm store. They're pulled directly from the charm store by Juju. They're cached locally on disk, and they're injected into the environment that we're targeting. So they're pushed into the Zookeeper tree in the Bootstrap node, and then they're available for the service units that are subsequently started by the provisioning agent to be pulled down and installed by Juju during that initial bootstrap of each server that's going to be supporting our service. So we end up with an isolated Memcached service and an isolated PostgreSQL service. Juju has some standard naming around its services, the service unit supporting services. So you'll see in this instance we have a Memcached/0 and PostgreSQL/0. As you scale out those individual services, you'll get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you can SSH to any one of those using Juju SSH subcommand and then giving it the service unit name if you need to log into a service unit and diagnose an issue with one. So in our local provider, the service units get created by using LXC, and the Juju then deploys the charm to those service units. So we're now going to deploy the Summit service itself alongside that. So Summit's not currently in the charm store. I expect it will be at some point in time, but it's really in development at the moment. We have one production type deployment in Plumbers, and we'll be doing the next Ubuntu Developer Summit using the charm as well. And I think at that point in time, we'll probably look for entry into the charm store. But we need to get some confidence around how it functions, how it works before we'll take that next step. So I've actually branched the Summit charm onto my local file system, and I use the local prefix to pick that up from my file system-based repository, and I deploy the Summit charm with the canonical name of EuroPython Summit. So we can now see we now have the third service unit running with the Summit charm installed. We're also specifying some configuration for this charm as well. So the Summit charm has a configuration YAML file which allows users of it to specify deploy time configuration. in this case, we're able to specialize this for the EuroPython Summit. We can specify where we're going to pull our application source from. In this case, it's a Bazaar branch, but that could actually be anywhere. And these are actually all features of the base Django charm as well. And then the theming, we're actually putting in the plumber's theme because I didn't have time to write a EuroPython theme for this presentation. So Juju supports most primitive types in configuration. Booleans, ints, floats, strings. You can provide default values if there are same default values. We're starting to introduce some standards around usernames and passwords, for example. So passwords should never have default values because that creates potentially exposed services on the internet, which people haven't really considered. Okay, so now we have 3 deployed services. We're able to relate them together. So as I said before, the semantics of Juju are at the service level, not the service unit level. So when we relate the EuroPython Summit to the PostgreSQL deployed service, we do it at the service level, not at the service unit level. Juju manages the firing of hooks at either end of that relationship to perform the relevant configuration both on the PostgreSQL database end, which is going to create a user and a password and the required infrastructure to allow the Summit charm to then create its database structure in the PostgreSQL database. The charm hooks can fire multiple times as configuration is passed from one end of the relationship to the other for all of the service units which may be supporting your deployed services. Same happens for the memcached service, although that's very much a one-way relation in that the memcached service will just tell it the EuroPython Summit charm, what IP address and port it's running on, and that's sufficient information for the Summit charm to then configure its caching tier. I think one key thing to highlight here is we could scale out the memcache service here by adding additional service units, because the Summit charm is able to support multiple memcache instances, and that is really very, very simple. And you can just do Juju add unit memcached, and Juju will then provision additional LXC instances, add them to that service, and the same set of hooks that we did during add relation will then fire again to notify the Summit deployed Summit service that there's an additional memcached server that it needs to start talking to. So the final step to actually get something that people can see and use is to expose the application. By default, any service you deploy using Juju is not exposed to the public. So within a data center and using Metal as service provider, that might not have much context, and the same applies for the local provider because you're very much sandboxed in a virtualized network environment that only your machine can see. But in the public cloud providers, the only access to any service unit by default is port 22, and that's using an SSH key pair that is specified automatically during in the environment bootstrap that we did right at the beginning of our example. So charms can specify how they should be exposed. So when all those hooks are running for the Summit charm, one of them would have executed the Juju open port command, which would have told Juju, when I am exposed, you need to expose me on these ports. So when we run Juju expose EuroPython Summit, for an EC2 provider, Juju is going to talk to EC2 and set up the security groups to allow that port on the service unit supporting that service to be exposed to the internet. So we end up with one deployed running charm, which you can see is exposed to the internet on port 80. Although it's not exposed to the internet, it's exposed to my laptop on port 80, so I can test it. However, it's not looking so great. Something didn't quite work when I was testing this, and I got a very big stack trace, and rather than admit defeat and look for a different charm, I thought, okay, so how do we debug this using Juju? So Juju provides some tools to help diagnose issues with charms. The first is the debug log subcommand in Juju. Basically, this is a log aggregation of all Juju charm activity through hooks firing across your entire deployed environment. So for a big environment, this can get very, very busy. When you're developing a local, it's relatively useful in that you can typically get a feel as to where in your hooks there is a problem with configuring or deploying your application. So it's good for your initial diagnosis as to where your issue is. You can then drop into the individual service unit where you've seen your problem and use debug hooks. So this is the first point in time when you will use the debug. You will actually address an individual service unit rather than the service itself. So you will pick one of your service units, you'll execute Juju debug hooks memcached/0, and Juju will drop you into a Biobu console. Biobu is a screen/Tmux-based session management tool for servers. And you will be dropped into the environment, the service unit within your environment which you want to debug. You can then remove your relation, add it back in. The hooks will fire, and you'll get a session started where you can actually look at the environment where your hook's going to be running. You can execute your hook manually, you can fix up your issue, and you can resolve your problem with your charm. You can then quit out of this and obviously farm your change back into the charm to make sure it deploys properly the next time. In this example here, I'm actually debugging the memcached hook. So you can see the in the EuroPython Summit charm. So you can see I've executed. Yeah.
I cannot actually see it. I cannot read the word on the screen. Your font is.
Is that too small?
Yes.
Sorry.
Can anyone else read it?
Can you?
It's just a great blur.
It is a little vague, this one. This is a screenshot rather than text, I'm afraid. So it's probably a little less distinct. But what it's really showing you, text description, cache relation changed hook being executed manually on the EuroPython Summit charm, so you can actually see how your hook's executing, what's happening, and debug your issue. Bring that back into your charm that you have on your local file system, fix and redeploy and retest. If you couldn't see that one, you won't be able to see this one. So the Summit charm is quite simple. 3 tiers. We can scale up some of those tiers. We can't scale up other ones of them. So at the moment, the PostgreSQL charm, you can't scale out. It's very much single deployment. The memcached one we can. We can't scale the Summit charm itself at the moment, although there's work ongoing to put Nginx in front of that to be able to allow that to scale horizontally as well. One of the first things we charmed when we started focusing on delivering charms to support Ubuntu server deployments was OpenStack. OpenStack is probably our most complicated charm set, as you can see by the spider diagram in front of you. And what we were really trying to do, and we realized very early on that there are a multitude of options in how you deploy OpenStack for a private or public cloud deployment. And the scale-out requirements within an OpenStack deployment as well. So we wanted to make it as easy as possible to be able to deploy OpenStack on hardware. Hence, things like the Ubuntu MAS project was started to allow Juju to provision actual physical servers to support deployed charms, specifically for OpenStack as our first use case. In fact, Mark Shuttleworth demoed deploying OpenStack live on stage at the OpenStack Design Summit 2 months ago. Which was very exciting and required a lot of work, so I didn't do that today. But we actually, in the Ubuntu server team, use Juju, MAS, and this set of OpenStack charms to do per-commit testing of OpenStack upstream trunk on the current Ubuntu development release and the current LTS release using Juju, MAS, and hardware. This runs multiple times a day. It's facilitated through a Jenkins deployment and some Python glue code to make it all hang together. But we can deploy OpenStack into that environment in about 11 minutes for 9 servers. And at the end of that, we have a deployed OpenStack environment we can then black box test using some of the stress and functional test suites that OpenStack provide from upstream. And you definitely won't be able to see this one. So Juju can scale as well. We hadn't tested this until 2 months ago in any serious manner. But during the Ubuntu Development Summit, we got the go-ahead to do some large-scale testing of Juju in EC2 because no one had 2,000 servers kicking around. So we picked one of the charms we knew where the application scales really well and is known to scale to thousands of nodes. In this case, it was Hadoop, and the Hadoop charm set has been around for a while. I'm the maintainer of it, and we know that Hadoop scales to many thousands of nodes in a single environment. What we didn't know is whether Juju could actually support that, and we found out lots of interesting things about where bottlenecks in our application was. Encoding of YAML, that sort of stuff, which really didn't work very well when we had 2,000 nodes in our deployment. But we've made a refactoring into Juju. It can now support single environments of this size. We were able to deploy to a 2,000 node Hadoop environment and run a TerraSort MapReduce on that to make sure we were exercising all the nodes effectively. It took a while to provision, about 7 or 8 hours to provision 2,000 nodes in EC2, but it can scale up to very, very large requirements as well. And you can read more about it at the URL at the bottom of the slide there. Okay, so summarize. Juju provides a great sandboxed environment using LXC for developing and testing charms. So if you want to get started with this now, you can run this on your laptop. You can run it in an EC2 instance and still use the LXC mode because it works there as well. If you want to do that, you don't want to scrub your laptop and do something different. You can also use that local provider for testing out or trying a charm from the charm store before you then spend some money on EC2 or hardware to actually deploy your services. The developer tooling is really good, is improving all the time. So I touched on 2 tools there, the debug log and the debug hooks. We also have another couple of non-core Juju projects which have sprung up, one called Jujujitsu, which is a wrap around Juju, which provides some additional sub-commands, which are quite useful for developers for diagnosing issues, generating nice graphy outputs and good graphical visualizations. And we also have charm tools, which is specifically aimed at charm developers. It allows you to generate a charm very, very quickly using template code, and then verify it using some static analysis to make sure it comes up to a minimum set of standards before you then submit it for a review and acceptance into the charm store. But by distilling all this DevOps knowledge early during the development of your applications, you get a very quick transfer from development to production deployment. So I would encourage anybody who's doing their own development to start thinking about how you're going to deploy your application very early on. I think that really helps developers ensure that the vision of how their application is going to be deployed actually turns into a reality when the IS department get hold of it at the end of the day, who are going to be responsible for its production deployment. It's really good for ensuring that the repeatable deployment of services, the repeatable scale up and scale down, and ensuring repeatable complexity as proven through the OpenStack charms that we have in Charm Store today. And switching provider is dead easy. The majority of charms you can take and you can deploy local, EC2, OpenStack, or on hardware, and they should just work out the box. So you can find me on Freenode. My nick is James Page. I don't think I really got nicks when I chose my nick. And there's a channel on Freenode as well, #Juju, where most of the charm community, Charmers community hang out. So if you want to try a charm, get some help. It's a little dead European time zone, but it sparks up in the afternoon. So I'm finished a little bit early on my 45 minutes of talk, so if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them now. Lots.
So there are some questions. I pass the microphone. I cannot reach everyone, so please pass it on.
Hi. Okay, it's working. Is there a mechanism for resource management? For example, if we deploy multiple charms on a single server, is there a way to somehow limit the amount of RAM or disk space each of those instances get?
Not at the moment. So the only way you can deploy multiple charms onto a single server at the moment is to use the local LXC provider. We only recommend that for development use at the moment. LXC, we don't enforce any constraints on the resources that each LXC instance can use. But if you're deploying charms into EC2 or onto hardware, we do have the concept of constraints that you can specify when you deploy a service. So if in Hadoop example, if our Hadoop data processing nodes want lots of memory and CPU, we can specify that at deploy time. So we can have mixed infrastructure requirement within one environment, but you can't lock that down in the local provider itself. Not at the moment. That may come later. And I think the Juju core team are looking at using the LXC provider to support exactly that deployment, where you want to have multiple services on a single machine, which are all isolated from other, and you can slice it up how you want. But that's not a production feature yet. That's a dev feature, and not as feature-rich as it should be.
Okay, so you mentioned 7 hours
Yeah.
number of
Yeah. So we found there was an increasing amount of time in the amount of time it took to serialize and deserialize the YAML representation in the environment that's stored in Zookeeper. And as the environment got bigger, that took longer and longer. We also found some bottlenecks in how Juju asks EC2 for more instances. So when you do add units to a service, it was actually requesting each of those units individually from EC2 rather than using the give me 200 units please API that you can use in EC2. So we found some provider bottlenecks, and we found some bottlenecks in the core of Juju as well. And that was part of that activity, was to take that learning and feed it back into actual trunk development. So I would expect now that it wouldn't take 7 hours to deploy 2,000 nodes. There is a certain element of how quickly can EC2 give us stuff, but there was a certain element of bottleneck in Juju as well. Doesn't sound like it.
Switching providers is easy, but then you only mention Ubuntu Server in your talk.
Okay.
To what extent is Juju limited on the operating system, both locally and on the server?
So within the environment, it's just Ubuntu Server at the moment. So you can use one of two or three releases, I think. So I think from Oneric onwards, 11.10 to 12.04. And to the current development release as well, you can use in your deployed environment. It's just Ubuntu Server at the moment. There is a minimum set of requirements for the guest OS that's going to be deployed into a Juju service unit that need to be met. So, for example, in Ubuntu Server deployments, we make extensive use of Cloud Init, which is a feature for Ubuntu Server. Some of these things are making their way into other Linux distributions as well, and they may come with time as a supported guest for target environments, but they're not there at the moment. On the client side, we now have support for using Juju from Ubuntu, from Debian, from OS X, if you happen to be running Mac, and there are RPMs available as well if you're running Fedora or Red Hat.
Hello. In this display of Juju, don't you think that it's a bit of a naive understanding of services, extremely general, sort of Hadoop cluster or Memcache or even Postgres? You're talking about deploying maybe 2,000 nodes. That's also perhaps a stress test, but it's a kind of maybe that's not a world that's really representative of big-scale deployment, where you can just say, give me this Postgres service, scale it up to 2,000 nodes, and then connect, some application to it. Does that actually work in practice? Because I think Juju might be a really strong foundation for making cloud deployment, but maybe with much more specialized charms. Maybe even, if you're a company, you'll write your own charms and you'll just use the Juju infrastructure to deploy it, but you won't actually use a charm store.
Okay, so the charm store does provide some best practice from which you can base your work from. I would encourage anybody who wants to add feature to a charm, because they want to specialize it, to try and get that feature fed back into the charm store version as well, because then the wider community of people can benefit from it. But I absolutely expect companies to take Juju, take maybe what's in the charm store, and use that as the basis for their deployment. So you kind of see that with what we've done with Summit, in that we've specialized it for a specific purpose. That work may never end up back in the charm store, I don't know. But I think when people start getting a feel as to the power of what Juju can do in terms of managing your deployed services at the service level rather than the service unit level, that yes, you will get that specialization and people will develop their own charms for the applications that they're having to support. So yeah, definitely.
We still have around 10 minutes for questions. Does anyone has a question? Okay, so I pass the two microphones, one here and one there.
While you're scaling up and down or changing providers, how do you make sure you don't lose valuable data that might be on a specific server that's a bit ephemeral and you don't really know where it is?
That's a really good question. That's not something that Juju can solve directly, okay? So, and maybe this points to the naivety of some of the charms we have at the moment, in that if you bin the environment, your data goes away. So you have to remember to extract your data before you destroy your environment. For the Hadoop charms specifically, I've been looking at some feature in there to allow you to persist a running environment and the data within a HDFS file system into S3, and then when you bootstrap your new environment, you can then pull that information back out of S3 and initialize that into your environment as it's deployed. So it's really up to the charm author, is the honest truth, to support that type of, okay, so when I start my environment, when I kill it, where do I persist my data to? And some charms don't have that feature or don't need it, but some do, definitely. So the database charms, for example, I don't know whether they have any specific features about how they persist on destruction and initialization, but they would be excellent features to have, definitely.
Another question.
You said that's not working, is it?
Okay.
You said you compared the charm store to the package management repositories.
Yes.
So how does Juju interact with the packaged version of whatever it is it's installing? Or does it just ignore the package manager and pull straight from the target zips?
So your charms won't typically contain the software you're deploying, okay? The kind of entry into the charm store benchmark for where you get your software from, you can definitely use the archive software if you want to. So there's a lot of charms out there that either pull directly from the main Ubuntu archive, or they pull from Launchpad Personal Package Archives, which is a individual or team-managed Deb repository that aligns to the main Ubuntu releases. That's definitely possible and is completely acceptable. You can also pull directly from upstream. If you want to pip install or easy install Python modules, that's fine as well, because they're coming from a well-respected source. If you're pulling a tar.gz of Java hell down, then as long as you can verify that it's being transferred intact and it checksums, and that's what the upstream said it was, which is pretty much what someone who was packaging that would have done when they pulled that tarball to package it, then that's fine as well. You don't have to use the main Ubuntu archive. You can use other sources as well, but it has to be verifiable and authenticated in some way to prove that the software you're installing is true to its origin. If you propose a charm that doesn't do that, it won't get in, it will get rejected, and you'll have to go and think again.
Thanks. Any other question? We still have time. Yeah.
Hi, how do you suggest putting your application code? I mean, do you need a special charm? Let's say I develop a Django application, so my 1,000 lines of code needs to be deployed maybe twice a day in the first days when I discover bugs in my application. How do I do that? Okay. I mean, I have a Git repository and I push to the Git repository. I'm a Heroku user.
So
What can I do?
you can pull directly from your Git repository. So we have a couple of charms in store that follow that same approach. The Summit charm, for example, there's no package version of Summit. It pulls from a tagged branch to then be deployed. We also have, everybody familiar with Etherpad Lite, which is a Node.js application. That pulls directly from GitHub. And as you deploy, you can specify what commit or what tag you want, and the user's then making a selection as to which version of the software. So you could use that same mechanism to say, okay, I want trunk of my branch, deploy please, test it. Or you could say, actually I want the tag version, which is a bit more stable, take that instead. That's an acceptable approach. Yeah?
Are charms versioned, as in if you've been developing and trying out the charm during development, but when you are deploying it, you pull the charm straight from the charm store with Juju. What if the charm gets updated in the store or something like that?
Yes, there is versioning built into charms. The charm store manages that automatically. So behind the charm store are the Bazaar branches in Launchpad that support charm development. When a new version is merged in of a particular charm, it's been peer-reviewed and tested, then that will be propagated into the charm store. The charm store will update the version number of that charm, and when you do Juju upgrade charm name, it will contact the charm store, check to see if there's a new version, pull that version down, and then deploy that into your running environment. There is a specific upgrade charm hook, which is designed to deal with transitioning from one version of charm to another in terms of doing any reconfiguration, installing any new software, whatever it is. And then there's obviously a Bazaar branch behind this that supports the actual development. One over there.
Is there any effort towards automating the scale up, scale down, or the failures from Juju?
In terms of notification back from Juju that those things have happened. Sorry, could you repeat your question? I didn't quite hear it.
When you have a...
Hold on, Matt.
Okay. When you have a cluster of nodes, for example, Hadoop, is there any way to automate when a server falls down, a node falls down or something like that, to automatically scale up or scale down the...
Okay. So there's no automation built into Juju at this point in time to do intelligent scale up and scale down. I would say that in probably the wider Juju tooling, that's definitely a feature that we're going to see delivered. With respect to an instance disappearing, so Amazon do something to kill your instance, which you didn't ask them to do, Juju will notice that, and it will start up a replacement unit to replace the one that's disappeared. So it will maintain the existing size of your environment, but it won't intelligently grow or shrink it at this point in time. And that's often scaling the environment is quite application specific as well in terms of what triggers a scale up or scale down event. So I suspect that to be, again, somewhat hook related in terms of being able to define your criteria for scale up and scale down, but it's not there as a feature yet.
Hi. Let's say I deploy a bunch of services and then I need to verify on a per service unit basis some kind of smoke test that this works and roll back. Is this something I write myself and chuck into a hook, or is there any functionality around this?
There's nothing explicitly in Juju that supports that. There is a proposal in place at the moment to support exactly what you're talking about at the moment. It's basically just a defined structure within the charm where you can drop your smoke tests, for example. And the real driver behind that is the automated testing we're doing at the moment. We want to have good ways of having test plans for charms so that we can deploy them using, for the ones that are in the charm store, we can deploy them using a known test plan and run a set of known smoke tests against them in much the same way we do for OpenStack at the moment, but that's a hardware requirement to do that. There's nothing official around that at the moment, but there's some informal stuff springing up which I expect to become official. But as a charm author, you write that, yeah.
Any other questions for the speaker? No? Okay. So I would like to thank James for this really nice speech, and he answered almost double the amount of questions that any other speaker we've seen today. So, thank you.
Thank you.
So just a little bit of information for you. The poster session will be in the main room of the hotel, and I remind you that there is a coding session today. So if you want to try to be the smartest guy to write the best code, there is a MacBook as a prize. So try to think about it. And thanks to be here. Conferma, Tagliatelle concluso. It was very nice. Okay.